Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm Edgar Wiggins, Executive Director of Baltimore Crisis Response Incorporated, and your host for this show that is dedicated to providing you with practical and useful information regarding mental health issues and needs. Being faced with a mental illness can be a daunting, challenging task for an individual and for any family. Our guest today is Mr. Roscoe Swan, and Roscoe is the president of the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, Prince George's County. He is someone who took his own personal experience in terms of coping with the mental illness of a loved one and turned that into a major advocacy effort. Thank you, Roscoe, for agreeing to be with us today on Mental Health Matters.
Thanks for having me.
I think a good place to start out would be by having you share your experience of what it was like for you when you first learned about the mental illness of your son.
Be happy to do that. And I think it's important that I do it that way because in my case it was a diagnosis that was at a reasonably advanced period of age. Mm-hmm. My son was 36 years of age, an adventurous type, the whitewater rafting guide, ski instructor during the winter, qualified diver, trained to be to dive at deep depths to recover things of value. And while at one of the resorts in the whitewater rafting country down in New River area in West Virginia, an incident came up and he chose to leave the lodge. The next day, he became extremely nervous, and in the process of getting help, we learned that he had a mental illness. He was diagnosed as being bipolar. Mm-hmm. And learning about the stages of these things later, I think my family went through every one of the stages and probably experienced each of the things that you would consider. It was disastrous, it was catastrophic. We experienced anger. It was certainly disruptive, and it was an alienating situation. Of course, not knowing anything about the illness, and certainly very little about the treatment at that point, coming out of a military background, my first reaction was to say it's nothing wrong with him. Mm-hmm. He doesn't want to work. It's another excuse. Mm-hmm. All of these things that would come to mind. And of course, I might be very candid with you and tell you that at that point I didn't have a great respect for those involved in the treatment of these type disorders. Probably at some point had used all of the phrases that, mm-hmm. that you hear. It was after going through the various stages, certainly the denial stage, mm-hmm. that we, my wife and I must say that she was the stronger of the two and the first to then come to moving toward the solutions, that we started to look at it and say, let's learn something about it. As I started to read, I found that that's very confusing in many respects because you don't know the language, you don't know the words. One of the things that we found was that there is a support group now. Mm-hmm. At that point, I knew very little about support groups, had never been involved in one as such. So we sought out a support group to find help. Now, we'll also tell you that at this point, my son was probably in a codependency phase. Mm-hmm. And later, at another time, we can probably go into that whole train of thought too, because which comes first and what happens and all of the other things. But I think now in my opinion, probably the codependency was a way of self-medicating as well as many other things. So to add to our difficulty now, as we got into the support group and we found that you need to get proper treatment, we ran into the roadblock of how do you get good quality treatment for someone that's codependent. As I got into the support group, I was amazed at how much help it provided. The first thing it provided for me is, you mean I'm not in this alone? I'm not the only one that's ever had a son that's faced a mental illness and at 36 years of age. I mean, there are others that are doing this routinely and living with it. So I found the support group gave me the strength, charged the batteries for me then to go and continue to look for the solutions. Now, at the same time, my son did some things that later, at the time, I would never have said were helpful, but because of one of his incidents, he was placed into a treatment facility. It was at that point that my wife and I made some hard choices and said if his behavior didn't change, then we were going to choose the tough love and say, you know, you've got to find some other ways of doing this. You're a grown man. He chose the right, made the right decisions, went into a program, got off of the alcohol and drugs, which then gave him the clear shot to get some good quality help for the psychiatric problems that he was faced with. So in '93, he became clean. He then went into the treatment. He's still been in the treatment the entire time, but he's found a medication routine that's helpful and convenient for him. He has since gone back to work. He has completed college. He had spent 6 years in college without a degree. He chose to go back to college. It was purely his decision. And so now he's back into the workforce. He clearly understands, though, in his case, the value of the support groups. So he's very active with all of those support groups that are good for him on both sides. And in the process, he is helping to give back. It was.
But let me ask you though. Let me interject a question at this point. Because what you have described is a progression of going from being overwhelmed, this is a catastrophic decision, and going through all the various things that have happened, to really becoming someone who has gotten education, has gotten some good advice, has learned and is learning about the system of care that's out there for folks. How did you get from point A to where you are now?
I would like to tell you that as a result of all of this, I jumped right in and said, I'm going to help everyone else. But like most people, I was hesitant to say that I could take on another task, I could get involved with another organization. But in NAMI Prince George's County, we've got some of the most dedicated people that you will ever find anywhere. And there was one particular lady that asked me if I would join the board. And I told her I didn't have time to do it. She insisted that I at least join a steering group that was helping to reorient NAMI Prince George's. I said that I would do that. As I got involved, I realized that it had been so useful to me that I owed it to the community to stay involved. So I stayed as a committee member, and like all committee members, you pick up chairman of a subcommittee. So I had the fundraising committee and then another one. And being somewhat vocal, every time I would make a recommendation, they'd say, that's yours. And so now, over time, I became vice president, and then for the last year and a half, I've been the president. committed to the cause because they're doing so much with so little. We're talking about a nonprofit, self-help organization that raises its own funds, provides its own training and resources with help from the NAMI structure, of course. But that's, in a short version, how I got involved and how I will probably stay involved in something of this nature. Mm-hmm. And that's also how I got involved with the Anti-Stigma Project, is meeting people through the NAMI Prince George's, and then faced with some of the same issues of how my son reacts to the illness, how we're forced to react to the illness because of the stigma involved, and my desire then to see that we change that as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What's been one of the most difficult things for you as you have been involved in this process now for many years?
Most difficult thing is understanding that at present there is no cure for mental illness. Mm-hmm. So it's a day-to-day understanding that at any minute it can change. Now in my case, I gave you the scenario where my son has now moved back into the workforce. I don't want anyone to think, though, that that means he is well. I clearly understand that he's not well. It takes a continuation of the treatment. It can be any stressor or anything that would change that. Perhaps the medication would stop being as useful. His routine may change. We could change that routine as well. And so living with the day-to-day understanding that the next phone call could be that we're back to step one in this process is very difficult. Having said that, by continuing to charge my batteries in the support group process, I continue to look at the things that I can do, that my family can do, to hedge against that happening. So you learn how to watch the phone bills and see when the calls are made at night, because it may be the first indication of mania. Or if there is no contact, it may be the first indication that it's a slip toward depression. So then what can I do to make that change? The other things that I think are very important is the family and the caregivers and all of the resources available to the person with the mental illness, I'm convinced, have an impact on the whole process.
That's right.
In my case, it was of no value for me to tell my son how easy it was to not be dependent if I couldn't show to him that I also didn't need to be dependent. So in the process of learning, my wife and I stopped using alcohol. Have no objection to people using alcohol. We chose to stop. But it was amazing how the channels of communication improved. My son and I now talk and share and explain and can handle things that previously the barriers there precluded. Some of those barriers, I'm sure, were the way we reacted, mm-hmm. the way we set the example in many cases. So there are many things that go into how you cope with it.
Well, we're going to talk some more about this important subject, but first we got to take a short break. We'll be right back.
When you mentor a child, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself, which, by the way, is pretty good.